Hi everyone. I know many of you are here watching this content to help you wind down or fall asleep. Before we begin, I'd love to know where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Now, let's get into tonight's story. Case 1. The murder in Amnat, Karanamnat, Karon, a quiet province nestled in northeastern Thailand, rarely makes international news. Known for its peaceful villages, ancient temples, and close-knit communities, life here moves at a slow, predictable pace. But in 2011, that tranquility was shattered. At the center of this chilling tale was a man named Somchai Niran, a 39-year-old businessman and well-known figure in the town. On the surface, he appeared to be just another hard-working local trading rice and cassava from surrounding farms. He was polite, attended village festivals, and seemed like a loving husband to his wife Denji, and a devoted father to their 2 sons. But behind this respectable image, Somchai harbored a dark secret. His agricultural trade was merely a cover. For years, he had been operating an illegal smuggling operation, using his business to discreetly transport contraband across the borders of Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. Still, it wasn't this criminal enterprise that would bring him down. What made headlines in 2011 was something far more personal and deadly. The disappearance. It all began in early April, when a 44-year-old farmer named Pritwan disappeared without a trace. Known for his diligence and quiet lifestyle, Prit tended to his rice paddies and raised chickens on a modest plot of land just outside the town. That morning, he left for his farm, as usual, but by nightfall, he hadn't returned. His family grew concerned and reported him missing the following day. At first, police suspected an accident, or that he may have gotten lost. But soon, something far more sinister came to light. A search led authorities to Prit's motorcycle, found abandoned near the banks of the Mung River. It had been dragged through the dirt, and fresh footprints led from it down toward the water. Then, 2 days later, a fisherman made a horrifying discovery. Floating in the tangled roots near the shore was a body badly decomposed, and clearly the victim of violence. It was Pritwan, a town in shock. Violent crime was rare in Amnat Karon. The discovery rocked the community. Who would want to harm Prit, and why? As investigators began digging, a motive quickly emerged. Prit had been embroiled in a bitter land dispute in the weeks leading up to his death. The man on the other side of that dispute, Somchai Niran. The two had been arguing over a small but strategically valuable piece of land near the edge of town. Prit claimed it was his by right. Somchai said he'd purchased it legally. The land just happened to border an old Seldamute road that led directly to the river. Prime route for smuggling goods undetected. What began as a civil disagreement had escalated into public confrontations. Villagers had seen them argue in the fields, at the marketplace, even along the roadside. But no one imagined it would end in bloodshed. The investigation police reviewed security camera footage from nearby shops. One clip caught a glimpse of a white pickup truck, identical to the one Somchai drove heading toward the river on the night of Prit's disappearance. Still, a truck on video wasn't enough to convict him. A forensic examination of Prit's body revealed bruises and binding marks, indicating he had been tied up and beaten before being dumped in the river clear. Signs of premeditation. The break in the case came from a young farmhand named Thanakrit, who worked for Somchai. During questioning, he hesitated, afraid to speak up, but eventually admitted that on the night Prit vanished, he had seen Somchai leaving his home in dark clothing, loading something into the back of his truck. With Thanakrit's testimony, the surveillance footage, and the forensic evidence, police moved in. Somchai was arrested at his home. As he was led away in handcuffs, he remained eerily calm, as if he had already accepted what was coming. The trial of Somchai Niran, became the biggest event Amnat Karon had seen in years. The courtroom was packed with locals, all stunned that a man they once admired now stood accused of murder. The prosecution portrayed Samchai as a manipulative figure, a man who wore a mask of respectability by day while running a criminal enterprise in secret. Prit, they argued, had become a threat. If Prit had won the land dispute, Samchai's hidden smuggling route would have been cut off, so he chose to eliminate the problem permanently. But the defense had its own strategy. Samchai's lawyer, a clever and calculating man named Chacha Dumak, argued that the case was built on circumstantial evidence and shaky testimony. He claimed there was no direct proof that Samchai had killed Prit, no eyewitness to the murder, no murder weapon, and no clear connection between the suspect and the riverbank where the body was found. Yet, as the trial continued, more troubling details emerged. Whispers of others involved, people who may have helped cover up the crime, or knew about it and remained silent. Conclusion: in the end, the case of Samchai Niran became a haunting reminder that even in the most peaceful towns, darkness can hide in plain sight. The man once seen as a pillar of the community was now a convicted murderer. His empire crumbled, his family disgraced, and his secrets exposed. Mnat Karon would never forget the tragedy of Pritwan and Samchai. He would go down in history, not as a businessman, but as the face of betrayal, greed, and the chilling cost of silence. Continuation of Case 1, The Fall of Samchai. Niran. The defense tried to hold its ground, insisting there was no direct evidence linking Samchai Niran to the murder of Pritwan. Yes, the prosecution had security footage showing a truck resembling his. Yes, there were witnesses who placed him near the crime scene that night. But, his attorney argued, none of it definitively proved that Samchai was the one who committed the act. Then came a twist no one saw coming. During the trial, a surprise witness stepped forward, someone who had not been part of the original investigation. Her name was Nur, a former warehouse worker employed by Samchai. Nervous and hesitant, she recounted a night weeks before the murder when she had overheard a tense phone call while working late. She hadn't caught much, but one line burned itself into her memory: handle it before it becomes a problem. The courtroom stirred. The prosecution seized on her statement. Who had Samchai been talking to? Was this the smoking gun, a glimpse into a premeditated plan? The defense, however, was quick to respond. They argued Nur's testimony was vague and circumstantial. There was no proof of who Samchai was speaking to, or what exactly he meant. But the prosecution had one more card to play. Police introduced new evidence: phone records. On the night of Prit's disappearance, Samchai's phone had pinged near the Mung River, the same location where Prit's body was later recovered. Even more damning, a second phone registered to one of Samchai's close associates. A man named Y. Suwat had pinged in the exact same location that night. Y was arrested and brought in for questioning. Unlike Samchai, he didn't fare well under pressure. Faced with a possible life sentence, Y broke. What he revealed changed everything. The confession, according to Y, Samchai had orchestrated the entire thing. He had lured Prit out under the pretense of discussing a peaceful settlement regarding their land dispute. But when Prit arrived, Samchai wasn't alone. Another man never named, believed to be a hired enforcer, was waiting. Prit tried to resist. A struggle broke out, but he was outnumbered. They beat him, bound him, loaded his body into the back of a truck. What followed was cold and calculated. They didn't leave the body in a field or roadside ditch. No, they took him to the river, hoping the water would mask the evidence, maybe suggest he had drowned or been mauled by wildlife. But something went horribly wrong. Prit was still alive when they threw him in. Witnesses later reported hearing strange splashes and muffled cries echoing from the river that night. At the time, no one gave it much thought. But in court, those memories became pieces of a horrifying puzzle. Even Samchai, who had maintained a stoic front throughout the trial, visibly flinched during Y's confession. The mask of innocence he had worn so carefully began to slip. After weeks of proceedings, the verdict was announced: guilty. Samchai was sentenced to life in prison. Why? In exchange for his cooperation, received a reduced sentence. The third man, the mystery enforcer, was never found. Some believed he fled across the border into Laos. Others speculated he had been silenced permanently. After Mothamnat Karon was left reeling. How had a man like Samchai lived among them for so long, without anyone realizing the depth of his deceit? The land at the heart of the dispute was seized by the government. Samchai's business empire collapsed. His reputation, once built on trust and success, was reduced to ash. Prit's family mourned deeply. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring him back. Samchai, meanwhile, was transferred to Bangkwang maximum security prison, infamously known as the Bangkok Hilton. It was a far cry from his former life of comfort and control. Here, status meant nothing. Everyone suffered the same. At first, Samchai carried himself with the same pride and arrogance he'd always known. But it didn't last. He quickly realized that behind prison walls, the rules were different. He used what remained of his influence to survive pulling strings, securing small privileges, but there was one thing he couldn't escape: the identity of the third man. It haunted him. Samchai had always believed he had control over every aspect of his operation. Loose ends weren't tolerated, and yet one remained. The enforcer had vanished without a trace. Why refused to speak of him further? Perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of loyalty. Either way, the silence was deafening. Samchai, once the puppeteer, now found himself a prisoner of paranoia. A new discovery back in Amnat Karon. Life slowly returned to normal on the surface, but beneath that calm, unease lingered. And then another body was found, on the banks of the Mung River. Not far from where Prit had died, a fisherman stumbled upon human remains. The body was bloated, the face unrecognizable, but the similarities were undeniable: bound wrists, shattered ribs, a fractured skull. Police said little, offering no official statement. But the rumors exploded. Was this the missing third man? Had someone tied up the final loose end? Some believed Samchai, even from prison, had managed to orchestrate a final silencing. Others whispered something darker, that Samchai hadn't been the mastermind after all, that someone else, higher up, had pulled the strings. Weeks later, inside the concrete confines of Bangkwang, Samchai received a letter. It had passed through countless hands to reach him. The handwriting was clean, deliberate. It read, "Loose ends are dangerous. Sleep well, Samchai." For the first time in his life, Samchai felt true fear. Case 2. The streets of Melbourne. The wind howled through the narrow alleys of Melbourne's western suburbs, rattling metal shutters and sending loose newspapers skittering across the pavement. It was the kind of night that made people keep their heads down, walk a little faster, and avoid unfamiliar turns. But for Darren Cole, the quiet was a comfort. It was in the dark that he thrived. Case 2. The shadows of Melbourne. Darren Cole and the art heist. Survival, for Darren Cole, had never been about brute strength. It was about precision, strategy, the ability to navigate a world where power wasn't given, it was taken. In the underbelly of Melbourne's western suburbs, Darren learned that success required more than just hustle. It required nerve, ruthlessness, and a willingness to cross lines others wouldn't even approach. By his late teens, Darren had become a name whispered with equal parts fear and admiration across Melbourne's criminal circles. Theft was his trade, but not the crude kind involving smashed windows or snatched wallets. Darren was a tactician. He studied his targets, understood their movements, mapped their vulnerabilities. His operations were swift, clean, and maddeningly effective. Police were always one step too late. But Darren wasn't content with small-time hits. By the early 2000s, he had his sights set on something grander: art and antiquities theft. Australia, with its complex colonial past, was rich in artifacts, some priceless, many poorly protected. Darren spent years building a network. Insiders in auction houses, master forgers capable of replicating anything, and black market collectors across the globe ready to pay in untraceable assets. Then came March 2011. His target, the National Gallery of Victoria. The prize, a collection of rare indigenous artifacts, including a ceremonial shield estimated to be nearly 2 centuries old. It was the kind of heist that could define a criminal legacy. The plan was airtight. Darren had tested the security system's weaknesses through multiple dry runs. He knew the camera loops, the guard rotations, and the silent alarms wiring like the back of his hand. A getaway route had been mapped with meticulous detail. Buyers overseas were standing by at 2:47 a.m. Darren and his team, 3 professionals he had worked with for years, breached the perimeter. Inside, the gallery was silent, the air tinged with the scent of aged wood and climate-controlled stillness. The artifacts were housed behind reinforced glass, but Darren came prepared. Within minutes, the display was breached. The priceless items were wrapped in protective casings and packed into custom-made boxes. Then everything unraveled. The silent alarm, which should have been disabled, was still live. A red light blinked in the shadows. Then came the sound. Blaring sirens. Deafening. Immediate. Darren's heart sank. They'd been betrayed. As the first police units closed in, the team scattered. Darren had planned for contingencies, but not treachery from within. The aftermath: by morning, the story had exploded across national headlines. The National Gallery heist was being called one of the boldest attempted art thefts in modern Australian history. One of Darren's crew, Michael Dean, was deadshot during the escape. Another had been captured hiding in a drainage tunnel near the Yarra River. The third, Adrian Scott, had vanished without a trace, and Darren, he had become a ghost, melting into the very streets he once ruled. But the net was tightening. Melbourne woke to flashing lights and sealed-off streets. Police flooded the gallery, collecting prints, scanning security footage, and tracing known associates. Darren knew the city was closing in. He had to vanish. The Flytaz news coverage spread. Darren moved through the back alleys of Footscray, stripping away the gear from the heist. The stolen artifacts were no longer with him. They were hidden in a secure drop site, a warehouse near the docks, registered under a fake name. If he could make it there, he could still salvage the job. But trust was a currency Darren no longer had. Michael was gone. Adrian missing. Had he been captured and flipped? Or had he betrayed Darren from the start? There was no time to grieve, no time for guilt. By mid-morning, Darren's face was plastered across TV screens and news sites. He had been identified as the mastermind. A full-scale manhunt had begun. Checkpoints were set up at train stations, highways, airports. But Darren always planned for pressure. His only hope was an old contact, Daniel Price, a man from a past job who owed Darren a favor. Daniel worked in the shipping industry. If anyone could smuggle Darren out of Melbourne without a trace, it was him. The rendezvous was set, midnight, at an abandoned dock in Williamstown. The betrayal: Darren spent the day in hiding, moving from safe house to safe house. He changed clothes, shaved his beard, donned glasses, anything to alter his appearance. The city felt smaller, more suffocating, with every hour. When night fell, he made his move. The Williamstown docks were silent, heavy with the scent of salt water and rust. A single cargo ship loomed, anchored and waiting. He spotted Daniel near the loading zone, speaking quietly with a dockhand. Relief washed over Darren for a moment. Then, floodlights burst to life. Voices shouted from every direction. "Police, don't move." Darren froze. In that instant, everything clicked. Daniel hadn't just failed him. He had sold him out. He had been betrayed. Darren didn't have time to process the sting of it. He just ran. His footsteps thundered against the concrete as gunfire cracked through the night behind him. There was only one way out. The water. If he could make it to one of the smaller boats moored nearby, he might still escape. The police were closing in. His lungs burned. Every muscle screamed in protest. Still, he pushed himself forward, faster, harder. He reached the edge of the dock and prepared to dive when everything erupted into pain. A gunshot. Darren's body jerked violently as fire tore through his shoulder. He fell into the cold, black water with a splash, sinking fast. Exhaustion and injury pulled at him like anchors. Above, flashing red and blue lights smeared into a kaleidoscope of chaos. Voices shouted, shadows moved, then dashed nothing. Silence, darkness, a void where time held no meaning. He was distantly aware of the icy water wrapping around him, of his limbs floating lifelessly, of voices echoing somewhere far above. His mind hovered between consciousness and oblivion until a jolt of pain ripped him back. Hands grabbed him, rough. Strong hands dragged Darren from the water and onto solid ground. He coughed violently, his lungs rejecting the seawater he'd swallowed. Through blurred vision, he could just make out the silhouettes of tactical officers looming over him, guns drawn, faces masked. He was surrounded. He had been caught. His thoughts were sluggish. Blood soaked his shoulder, the bullet having torn through muscle but spared anything vital. It didn't matter. He knew the game was over. For years, he'd been a ghost outsmarting Melbourne's best, running flawless operations, staying one step ahead. But now, all of it had come crashing down. One betrayal, one mistake. As paramedics treated his wound, Darren stared up at the night sky. The city lights twinkled in the distance, cold, indifferent. There was irony in it all. He'd built a life, in the shadows, always evading capture. But now, the city had finally claimed him. The aftermath, the days that followed, blurred into a storm of courtrooms, lawyers, and media headlines. The art heist of the century, the press called it. Every secret of Darren's criminal past was dragged into the spotlight. The prosecution's case was airtight surveillance footage, physical evidence, and, worst of all, betrayal from within. Adrien, Scott, his old partner, the man who sold him out in exchange for a lighter sentence. Darren had always known trust was a rare currency in his world, but knowing and feeling it were two very different things. When the verdict came, it was no surprise. Guilty, on all counts. Life in prison. He'd always thought of prison as a place for careless criminals, those who slipped up. He'd just managed to delay the inevitable as he was led from the courtroom. Cameras flashing, reporters shouting his name. Darren wasn't broken, because deep down, he knew he wasn't done. Inside prison was its own ecosystem, ruled, not by law, but by power. Power built on alliances, secrets, favors, and fear. Darren adapted quickly. He learned who to trust, who to avoid, how to make himself valuable. Even behind bars, his mind never stopped. He observed, listened, waited. There were cracks in every system, and cracks could be widened. Guards could be bribed. Schedules could be exploited. Darren Cole had spent his life slipping through the cracks. Prison was just another challenge, because the game wasn't over yet. Case 3, Ashwood, was the kind of place that looked untouched by time. Rolling hills, thick forests, and winding roads. Everyone knew everyone. Crime, if it happened at all, was nothing more than a drunken scuffle or a stolen lawnmower. Until the summer of 1997. That year shattered Ashwood's peaceful image, and at the center of it all was a man named Earl Matthews. Earl had lived his entire life in Ashwood. Broad-shouldered and weathered, he ran a modest auto repair shop on the edge of town. Folks trusted him. He was known to fix a neighbor's car for free or forgive a debt if someone had fallen on hard times. But behind the friendly small-town image, Earl was drowning. His business was failing. The bills were relentless. The repo man had already taken his truck once. His marriage collapsed under the weight of financial pressure, leaving him bitter, alone, and desperate. And then, there was the gambling. What began as friendly games at the bar spiraled into deep debts, so two men who didn't offer second chances. First came warnings, a slashed tire, a rock through the window. Then the calls in the dead of night. He needed money, fast. July 17th, 1997. It was just before closing time when Earl pulled into the lot across from the town's First National Bank, a small, family-run institution that had been part of Ashwood for generations. He waited until the last customers left. He knew the manager, Tom Grady, always stayed late to balance the books. Earl walked in wearing a ski mask and carrying a shotgun. His heart pounded in his ears. Ashwood wasn't prepared for this. The bank had no real security, no guards, just Tom and a safe full of cash. According to the report, what happened next was unclear. Some believed Tom went for the silent alarm. Others said Earl panicked. What was certain was this: when the smoke cleared, Tom Grady lay dead. Blood pooled across the floor beneath him. Earl Matthews had just killed a man and nothing would ever be the same. Time slowed in the wake of the gunshot. Its echo clung to the air inside the small-town bank, bouncing off the walls like a ghost, refusing to fade. Earl stood frozen, hands clenched around the shotgun, as if squeezing tighter could somehow undo what had just happened. Tom Grady lay on the ground, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic gasps. A crimson halo spread beneath him, seeping into the aging tile. His wide, unblinking eyes darted aimlessly, his lips twitching in a futile attempt to speak, but no words came. Earl hadn't meant for this. The plan had been simple. Get in, grab the money, get out before anyone noticed. But the moment he pulled the trigger, that plan disintegrated. The weight of what he had done crashed over him like a landslide. Still, his body moved on instinct. He couldn't freeze now. He bolted toward the counter, vaulting over it with a stumble. His hands trembled violently as he fumbled at the register. The drawer sprang open. He snatched fistfuls of bills, stuffing them into the duffel bag slung over his shoulder. But it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. His gaze shot toward the back office. The safe. Earl had worked on Tom's car. Once he remembered him talking about the safe. No time delay, no alarms, just an old-fashioned combination lock. Earl rushed past Tom's dying body, boots leaving prints in the spreading blood. He didn't dare look down. The safe loomed in front of him, cold steel and finality. He didn't know the combination, and there was no time to figure it out. He struck the lock with the butt of his shotgun. Nothing, not even a dent. Then came the sound that froze him. In place, gravel, crunching outside. A car had just pulled into the lot. Panic hit like a tidal wave. He'd made too much noise, stayed too long. He was supposed to be in and out, but now he was trapped. He spun around and sprinted for the front. His boots slipped in blood as he ran, nearly sending him crashing to the floor. At the doors, he yanked off his mask and shoved it into his pocket. If anyone saw him now, he wouldn't look like a masked criminal. He'd look like Earl Mathis, the local mechanic, just another man on his way home. But the car that had pulled up wasn't just anyone. Sheriff Bill Lanham stepped out, a seasoned lawman, 20 years on the force. He'd seen bar fights, break-ins, the occasional stolen tractor, but nothing like this. Driving by, he'd noticed the bank's front door ajar. Odd. It should have been locked by now. Now he watched as Earl Matthews walked out, pale as a ghost, a heavy duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Something didn't sit right. Earl forced a casual wave. "Evening, Bill," he said, trying to steady his voice. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Everything all right, Earl?" Earl tried to smile. "Yeah, just finished working on Tom's car earlier, came by to tell him, but looks like he already headed out." Bill's gaze dropped to the bag, then to Earl's trembling hands. The silence stretched. A siren wailed somewhere in the distance. Earl's stomach knotted. He had to get out. "Well, I'd better head on home," he said, taking a step toward his truck. Sheriff Lanham didn't move. "You sure about that, Earl?" His voice was calm, but there was a warning under the words. Earl tightened his grip on the bag and nodded. "Yep, long day." The sirens grew louder. The sheriff's hand drifted toward his holster. Earl ran by the time Lanham stepped into the bank and found Tom Grady's lifeless body. Earl Matthews was already tearing down back roads in his pickup, dust clouds billowing in his wake. He had no plan, no direction, just one instinct: get as far away from Ashwood as possible. But the money in the bag felt worthless now. It wouldn't fix anything. He'd made a mistake, a deadly one, and it would haunt him forever. News of the shooting spread quickly. Within the hour, roadblocks sprang up across the highways. County deputies, state troopers, even helicopters joined the manhunt. The FBI was called in. Earl had vanished into the thick Kentucky wilderness, but he couldn't hide forever. Night swallowed him whole. His truck jolted down uneven back roads, gravel spitting under his tires. His grip on the wheel was slick with sweat, breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The sirens were behind him, but they were out there, still searching, closing in. He knew these hills, knew the winding paths, the unmarked trails, the forgotten woods. If he could just disappear just long enough, maybe he had a chance. But Tom's face kept returning. The shock in his eyes, the blood, the way his final breaths rattled like a dying engine. Earl clenched his jaw and pushed the thought away. The truck's headlights cut through the dark, revealing the tight, twisting road ahead. Trees loomed close on either side, the forest thick with shadow, then flashing lights in the rearview mirror, blue and red. They had found him. Earl's heart slammed in his chest. No thinking now, only instinct. He stomped on the gas. The truck roared forward, tires skidding. Behind him, a patrol car surged in pursuit. Sirens screamed through the trees. He veered off the main road, barreling down a narrow dirt path. Branches clawed at his truck, scraping the sides like fingers trying to drag him back. Still, he drove. The road grew rougher. Rocks thudded against the undercarriage. The truck groaned in protest. The chase had only just begun, but the road ahead was unforgiving, and Earl Matthews was running out of time. Earl could feel the truck fighting him, the tires slipping, the wheel bucking under his hands. Behind him, the sheriff's cruiser still chased, red and blue lights flashing through the night, like a grim omen. The deeper he drove into the woods, the harder it was for them to keep up. Then came the mistake, a sharp turn. Loose gravel, his truck fishtailed violently. Earl yanked the wheel, but it was too late. The back tires lost grip. Everything spun. Metal screamed as the truck veered off the road, crashing through a thicket of trees before slamming into a ditch. Silence followed. Only the hiss of the engine remained, steam rising into the cold Kentucky night. Earl groaned, pain lancing through his ribs. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, but he ignored it. He had to keep moving. He grabbed the duffel bag, shoved open the door, and stumbled into the underbrush. His legs barely held him, but he didn't stop. Behind him, the sheriff's car finally rolled to a stop. Flashlights cut through the trees. Voices echoed. They were close. Earl ran dot for 2 days. He evaded capture. The woods became his shelter, his prison, and his personal hell. With no food, no water, only the shotgun on his back and the bag of stolen money clutched tight, he wandered deeper into the wilderness. Cold winds sliced through his clothes at night, and hunger gnawed at his insides. Helicopters circled overhead. Dogs tracked his scent through the damp earth. Every road out was watched. Every trail was blocked. Then, by sheer luck, he found an old hunting cabin, half swallowed by the woods. The roof sagged. The windows were stained with years of dust, but it was shelter. Earl forced his way in and collapsed onto the floor. Exhaustion swallowed him whole. He lit a fire, but someone had already seen the smoke by sunrise. The woods were crawling with law enforcement, state troopers, U.S. Marshals, local police. Dozens of vehicles lined the dirt road leading to the cabin. Voices shouted through the trees, urging Earl to surrender. But Earl Matthews wasn't the kind of man to give up. He had fought his whole life, fought poverty, fought circumstance, fought every crooked hand he'd ever been dealt. If this was the end, he'd face it on his own terms. The shotgun felt cold in his hands. The duffel bag lay beside him, heavy with the money that had cost him everything. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made the world hold its breath. Then one final shot. It echoed across the Kentucky hills, sharp and solitary. When the officers finally breached the cabin, they found Earl slumped against the wall, the duffel bag still gripped in his hands. He was gone. The dream, the chase, the fight, it had all ended here, in the town of Ashwood. His name was never forgotten. Some called him a fool, others, a desperate man who never stood a chance. But in the end, none of it mattered. Earl Matthews became a ghost of the hills, another legend, another man who ran, another man who fell, and the world moved on. Case 4. In the vast deserts of Nevada, where highways stretch endlessly under a scorching sun and dust creeps into every forgotten building, lived a man named Daniel Danny Whitmore. To outsiders, Danny was just another drifter, a man in his late 30s, drifting from town to town, never putting down roots. His past was as scattered as footprints in desert, sand erased by time and wind. But for those unfortunate enough to truly know him, Danny wasn't just a wanderer. He was something darker. Born in 1976 near Reno, Nevada, Danny's childhood was shaped by instability. His father was a long-haul trucker, rarely home. His mother scraped by with odd jobs. Nights were lonely. Danny would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the highway outside, and dreaming of escape. By his late teens, resentment toward authority had taken root. He believed the world had dealt him a losing hand and he meant to even the score. He started small petty thefts, break-ins, scams. But what made Danny dangerous was his ability to vanish. He could slip through cracks, disappear before consequences, could catch up. Over the years, his crimes escalated. Identity fraud, forged documents, new names, new towns. He drifted through Nevada, Arizona, California, leaving behind a trail of confusion and unanswered questions. But in 2008, Danny wanted more. He was done with petty crime. He wanted a big score, one that would finally buy him the freedom he'd chased his entire life. That summer, he arrived in Eureka County, Nevada, specifically the small sun-baked town of Crescent Valley. He introduced himself as Greg Larson, a supposed businessman looking to invest in land. He asked around about properties, abandoned cabins, old mining rights. Locals found him charming, polite, curious. No one suspected he was studying them. Then, one October night, a young waitress named Sarah Holloway vanished. At first, no one panicked. People left Crescent Valley all the time, but Sarah wasn't the type. She was reliable, grounded. Her friends, her boss, everyone knew something was wrong. A week later, her car was found. It was abandoned near a derelict mining site deep in the desert. The doors were locked. The keys were in the ignition. Sarah was gone, and Greg Larson, he had vanished too. Sarah's apartment remained untouched. Her clothes still hung in the closet. Her purse was on the kitchen counter, only she was missing. Asterisk, the town buzzed with fear and speculation. The Eureka County Sheriff's Department launched a search, but resources were scarce. Officers combed through barren land, calling her name. But the desert swallowed everything, and behind every whisper, one name kept surfacing: the stranger, the drifter, the man calling himself Greg Larson, the man whose real name was Danny Whitmore. Whispers had started to spread. Locals remembered seeing him at the diner, striking up casual conversations with Sarah in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Some said he asked odd questions, where she lived, when she worked, whether she had family nearby. Others recalled spotting him in the parking lot, just watching her, not doing anything, just lingering, too long to ignore. But when investigators tried to find Greg Larson, they hit a wall. Because Greg Larson didn't exist. The man who called himself Greg had vanished just as quickly as he appeared. His identity, a businessman with clean credentials, turned out to be a carefully constructed lie. The documents he used to rent apartments, open accounts, even buy a car, all forged. His vehicle, registered under another stolen name. Every lead investigators chased collapsed into a dead end. Then, a second person disappeared. A week after Sarah was reported missing, a ranch hand named James Ruhr failed to show up for work. Unlike Sarah, James was a known drifter. He'd arrived in Crescent Valley just a few months prior, picking up odd jobs, keeping mostly to himself. With no family nearby and no close friends to raise the alarm, his absence went unnoticed. His boss went to check on him. The small trailer James had been staying in was abandoned. His wallet was on the counter. His truck still parked outside, but James was gone. That's when the town's concern turned to fear. One missing person could be an unfortunate tragedy, but two within the same weekend, a quiet town where crime rarely escalated beyond bar fights and unpaid debts. Something was very wrong in Crescent Valley. The search intensified. Police scoured abandoned buildings, re-interviewed witnesses, retraced the steps of both Sarah and James. But the break in the case came in the most horrifying way imaginable. A hunter, trekking deep into the desert near a dried-up creek bed far from any main road, noticed something unusual, what looked like a shallow grave. At first he thought an animal had been buried and disturbed by shifting sands. But as he stepped closer, the truth became painfully clear. The remains belonged to Sarah Holloway. She had been buried hastily, covered in loose dirt and scattered stones, as if someone had left in a rush. The cause of death was immediately evident, a single gunshot wound to the head. Authorities swarmed the scene, but the desert had done its work. Footprints were gone, erased by wind. Tire tracks had long since faded. Still, they found something, a discarded cigarette butt near the grave. DNA tests confirmed what investigators feared: it belonged to Danny Whitmore. But Danny was nowhere to be found. Then the case grew darker still. Just a mile from Sarah's grave, another burial site was discovered. This one was older, the body more decomposed. Dental records confirmed what the town already suspected. It was James Ruhr. Unlike Sarah, James hadn't been shot. He had been strangled. His body bore signs of a brutal struggle: bruises broken, fingernails, defensive wounds. He had fought back. Investigators theorized he may have encountered Danny after Sarah's murder. Maybe he saw something. Maybe he became a liability. Or maybe Danny had simply chosen him too. But why? What connected Sarah Holloway and James Ruhr? Were they merely in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or did Danny choose them with purpose, part of a twisted logic only he understood? Police ramped up the manhunt. Danny's last known vehicle was found abandoned in rural Arizona, outside a gas station. The cashier remembered a man matching his description, paying in cash, then walking into the night. From there, nothing. He was gone. Again, days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Crescent Valley, once a quiet place where nothing ever happened, now wore the scar of something unthinkable. Fear clung to its streets like a fog. Some residents packed up and left, unwilling to live in a town where a killer had walked so freely. But one thing was clear: Danny Whitmore was still out there. For years, the case remained open, but cold. Authorities followed every tip, every alleged sighting, but they led nowhere. Some believed Danny had fled to Mexico, living under stolen names. Others were sure he had gone feral, hiding in the wilderness like a ghost. There were even whispers that he had never left, blending into another small town, hiding in plain sight. Then, In 2015, 7 years after the murders, the case cracked open in the most unexpected way. A motel manager in a remote part of Utah grew suspicious of a guest who had stayed for weeks. The man paid in cash, spoke little, left his room only after dark. Unnerved, the manager called the local sheriff. A deputy arrived, expecting to find a reclusive drifter. What he found instead sent shock waves through law enforcement. The man in room 107 was Danny Whitmore. When officers attempted to arrest him, Danny bolted, vanishing into the Utah wilderness. The years had changed him. His once clean appearance was now rugged, a scraggly beard, graying hair, and a thin, weathered frame. But one thing hadn't changed: his will to run. The manhunt lasted 4 days. Helicopters scanned the canyons. Search teams combed the terrain. But Danny was a survivalist. On the run had sharpened his instincts. It wasn't until a group of hikers stumbled across a hidden camp deep in the mountains that the hunt ended. The camp was crude, just a tarp tied between trees, a makeshift fire pit, and scattered cans of food. But it was the box of notebooks that chilled investigators to their core. Inside were pages and pages of writings, years' worth of thoughts, confessions, and obsessions. Danny had chronicled his life on the run, his movements, his paranoia, and worst of all, his crimes. He wrote about Sarah, how he had watched her, followed her, convinced her to trust him. He described in disturbing detail how he lured her into the desert, and how, in his own words, he watched the light leave her eyes. But his writings about James Ruhr were different. According to Danny, he hadn't planned to kill James. James had seen something gotten too close. Danny claimed it was an accident. A confrontation turned violent. But the truth didn't matter anymore. He had taken 2 lives, and for 7 years, he had walked free, fading into deserts, forests, and the forgotten cracks of America. But his time was finally up. The desert had hidden him for years, but in the end, it also gave him up. Case 4. The predator returns. It could have been an accident, a loose end. Maybe James saw something he wasn't supposed to. Maybe he caught sight of Danny returning from the desert that night, or perhaps he simply crossed paths with him at the wrong time. Danny had lured him in with a lie, pretending to need help. James fought back. He begged for his life. But Danny didn't care. The struggle, that was the thrill. In his journals, Danny described it with disturbing satisfaction. The fear, the resistance, the moment he overpowered his prey. That was when it became clear it wasn't just about eliminating witnesses. It was about enjoying it. And James wasn't the only one. Danny detailed other close calls, moments where he had stalked someone, ready to strike, but pulled back. Maybe fear stopped him. Maybe he wasn't ready, but he wanted to. He was waiting for the right moment. When authorities finally closed in, Danny was a shell of a man. Exhausted, starving, his body worn down from years of isolation and hiding. He didn't resist. When they surrounded him, he just sat there, hollow-eyed, staring through them. And then, as dawn broke over the desert, he smiled a slow, eerie grin that chilled even the most hardened officers. Danny Whitmore was arrested without incident at trial. The evidence was overwhelming. His journals sealed his fake confessions in his own hand, describing everything in grotesque detail. The prosecution didn't have to prove motive. Danny had done that himself. He was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even behind bars, he disturbed those around him. Guards said he rarely spoke, rarely moved. But at night, they sometimes caught him staring at the walls of his cell, silent, as if reliving every second of the hunt. The name Danny Whitmore would become one of Nevada's most infamous. A man who killed for pleasure, who disappeared into the desert, only to reemerge years later, still craving the hunt. And perhaps the most unsettling detail of all, his final journal entry, written just before his arrest, contained only 5 chilling words. I was never really done. Case 5. The Shadow on Route 250, deep in the heart of Virginia, where rolling hills and thick forests stretch for miles. A crime once occurred that would scar a community for decades. The year was 1997, small town. Life in Virginia still clung to the illusion of safety, but that illusion shattered with the case of Edward Eddie Calloway Menuza, man who would become synonymous with terror. By all accounts, Eddie was unremarkable. A mid-40s truck driver with no criminal record and a life so ordinary, no one would have guessed the darkness that lived beneath the surface. Born and raised in the quiet town of Staunton, nestled in the Shenandoah Valley, Eddie's childhood had been steeped in dysfunction, an overbearing father, a mother too afraid to intervene. He was the kind of kid who never quite fit in, preferred solitude. Long stretches behind the wheel became his escape, driving lonely highways, his thoughts drifting in the static of late night radio. But on the night of October 23, 1997, that quiet, uneventful life transformed into something monstrous. Route 250 was a desolate stretch of road cutting through Augusta County, lined by forest, abandoned farms, and the occasional gas station. At night, it became a place of shadows, silent and unnervingly still. It was here that Marissa Langford, a 23-year-old college student, was last seen alive. She had been driving home from Richmond after visiting friends. Her car was loaded with textbooks and leftover pizza. A history major at the University of Virginia, Marissa was known for her sharp wit and infectious laugh. Her parents expected her home by midnight, but when 2 a.m. came and went with no sign of her, panic set in. At 2:45 a.m., a trucker called in a report: an abandoned vehicle on Route 250. The driver's side door hung open. The engine was still running. Marissa's purse sat untouched on the passenger seat, but she was gone. A search began immediately. Police combed the roadside with flashlights, moving deeper into the woods. Half a mile from the highway, they found her. Beneath a fallen oak tree, Marissa lay lifeless. Her clothes were disheveled, her belongings scattered across the forest floor. It looked like she had fought hard, but there had been no struggle by the road, no evidence of force. It was as if she had stepped out willingly, never suspecting what was about to happen. The coroner's report confirmed she had been strangled. No signs of sexual assault, no theft, just a senseless act of violence. The town was paralyzed with fear. Women stopped driving alone at night. Route 250 became a road to avoid. Flyers with Marissa's face appeared on telephone poles and gas station doors, but there were no witnesses, no suspects, no leads. Not until 1 week later, a grainy image surfaced: security footage from a rest stop 20 miles away. It showed a dark-colored Mack truck pulling out of the lot at 1:57 a.m. The same night, Marissa disappeared. The truck had a dented front bumper. The timestamp aligned almost exactly with the timeline of the crime. It wasn't much, but it was. Something that rest stop police would soon learn had been a familiar place to Eddie Calloway. He had been there that night, buying coffee and cigarettes. His truck, it matched the one in the footage. Same model, same dent. When police arrived at his home in Staunton, the truck was parked in the driveway, its bumper bearing the same unmistakable dent seen in the video, and that was just the beginning. The evidence was circumstantial, but investigators had a gnawing suspicion Eddie Calloway was hiding something. What they would eventually uncover, buried deep in his past, would turn out to be far worse than anyone imagined. When the police knocked on his door, Eddie didn't resist. He opened it with a weary look, wiping his grease-stained hands on his jeans like they were old friends, just stopping by. His truck sat silently in the driveway. Mechanical witness: two secrets too heavy to speak. We just want to ask a few questions, one officer had said, but Eddie already knew. He'd seen the news, he'd heard the whispers, and he knew this day would come. Inside, His home was a cluttered, dimly lit cave of faded days. Ashtrays overflowed, beer cans lined the counters. A sagging couch, an old, flickering TV, and a forgotten calendar from a trucker convention in the 80s were all that decorated the space. It was unremarkable until Eddie opened his mouth. They weren't expecting a confession that day, and Eddie didn't give one. But he gave them something else: inconsistencies. He claimed he'd been at the rest stop but said he left before midnight. Then it was 1 a.m. Then he wasn't sure at all. His alibi collapsed even further when officers noticed fresh scratches on his forearm. Unloading cargo, he claimed. But his employer said otherwise. Eddie hadn't had any deliveries in days. Police impounded his truck. That's when they made their first discovery. Under the passenger seat, barely noticeable, was a torn piece of red cotton fabric. At first glance, it looked meaningless. But lab tests confirmed the worst. It was a match to Marissa Langford's sweatshirt. That was enough for an arrest. But it was only the beginning. As investigators dug deeper into Eddie Calloway's past, a far darker truth emerged. They had been looking for one victim. What they found, was 5. The first was in 1989. Susan Alden, a young hitchhiker, was found strangled along an abandoned service road near Roanoke. No suspects, no clues. Then in 1992, Diana Morton, a 27-year-old waitress from a roadside diner, was last seen climbing into a dark-colored truck. Her body was discovered 2 weeks later in a shallow grave outside Lexington. 2 more women followed. All vanished near highways. All later found stripped of dignity and left to rot in the wilderness. Police had long suspected a serial predator but could never connect the cases. Until now, Eddie Calloway had been in every town, on every route where these women had disappeared. Receipts, toll logs, delivery records all placed him near the scenes, always just ahead of suspicion. A ghost drifting through Virginia's roadways. But what disturbed investigators most came from Eddie's locker at his trucking depot. Amid a pile of old magazines and faded paperwork, they found a small dented tin box. Inside, wrapped carefully in plastic, were trophies. A lock of hair tied with ribbon, a broken bracelet, a photograph of a girl no one could identify, and at the bottom a student ID. It belonged to Marissa Langford. On November 4th, 1997, Eddie Calloway was arrested and charged with Marissa's murder. As word spread, families of other missing women flooded investigators with calls, desperate for answers. The trial gripped Virginia. The evidence, the fabric scrap, the locker, the logs, was overwhelming. But Eddie never confessed. Not to police, not to his attorney, not even in private. He sat in court, cold and expressionless, unmoved by photos, testimonies, or verdict. When the jury declared him guilty of first-degree murder, sentencing him to life without parole, he simply nodded as if he had known all along. Eddie Calloway died in prison 6 years later. He never spoke about the other victims, never gave locations, never offered names. Some believed there were more, many more. Bodies never found. Families left in limbo. And with Eddie's silence, the truth died with him. Even after his death, in 2003, the wounds he left behind never healed. For the families both of the identified and the unknown, the trauma lingered. Route 250, once just another stretch of road, became a symbol of everything that was taken. Diners where women had their last meals became solemn landmarks. Gas stations where they were last seen turned into places of dread. Among long-haul drivers, the legend of Eddie Calloway only grew. Some swore they had parked beside him, shared meals, swapped cigarettes. None had ever suspected a thing. And in the years that followed, eerie tales began to surface. Truckers claimed to see a lone figure standing by the roadside at night, a man with a blank expression, watching silently as vehicles passed. Some reported hearing their names whispered over CB radios, right before the signal cut out into static. A few even claimed to spot a battered old semi, resembling Eddie's final rig, idling at empty rest stops, engine running with no driver in sight. Many dismissed it all as highway folklore, but those who knew the case, WEREN, single quotes T so sure, even in death, Eddie Calloway remained a ghost, a shadow on the highway. Investigators occasionally revisited the case files, hoping new technology might crack the unanswered puzzles. DNA testing, profiling, forensic advancements, they all helped solve other cold cases across the country. But for Eddie's suspected victims, the evidence was often long gone. The bodies never found. Witnesses passed away. Leads vanished into time. Still, some families held on to hope. Maybe one day, someone would connect the dots. Maybe a missing girl in a forgotten case file would finally get her name back. Maybe buried in the dust of back roads and truck stops, the truth still waits. Until then, Route 250 remains what it has always been, a long, empty stretch of highway, haunted by the whispers of the past, marked by the ones who never made it home. Case 5, Shelton, Washington. There's a familiar unease among long-haul trucker stories, passed quietly from one driver to another, about dimly lit rest stops where a chill creeps in from the trees, where headlights cut through the fog, and something unseen watches from the woods. Some even swear that on certain nights, when the Virginia backroads are shrouded in mist, you can still hear the low growl of an idling engine just beyond the tree line. A phantom semi, waiting in silence, waiting as if it never truly stopped. Some horrors don't end. Some roads are better left forgotten. The small town of Shelton, Washington, nestled along the southern edge of Puget Sound, was once the picture of peace. Misty mornings, towering evergreens, and a tight-knit community gave it a postcard charm, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. Crime was rare, mostly petty theft, the occasional bar scuffle, nothing that truly disturbed the town's rhythm. But in 1997, something happened that shattered that illusion. A crime so brutal, so calculated, it left a scar on Shelton's memory that is never quite healed. The man behind it wasn't a stranger. He was one of their own. James Jim Lton had lived in Shelton his entire life. At 38, he was a former logger, big, broad-shouldered, with a face hardened by years of labor under the relentless Pacific Northwest rain. After the timber industry dried up, he scraped by doing odd jobs around town. Folks knew him, or thought they did. He was just another quiet man with calloused hands and a short temper. A little too friendly with the bottle. But Jim harbored a secret, a growing obsession with wealth, power, and annoying resentment toward anyone who had what he didn't. He blamed everyone, the government, the economy, even his neighbors. Over time, that bitterness festered into something darker. While others slept, Jim disappeared, driving out toward the dense wilderness on the edge of town. He told people he was hunting, though he never returned with game. Sometimes he claimed to be panning for gold, but never produced a single nugget. The truth, Jim was preparing. It began on a cold November evening. The sun had dipped behind the trees, casting the town in that short-lived amber hue, before surrendering to night. Jim was last seen that day at a gas station, buying fuel and cigarettes, nodding to the attendant he'd known since childhood before vanishing down the road, toward the woods. For weeks, there was silence. Then, deep in the forest, a hunter stumbled across something strange, what looked like a tarp buried under a blanket of autumn leaves. But as he got closer, dread surged. It was fabric-ripped, stained, and wrapped around something that reeked of death. Authorities arrived quickly. What they uncovered would send shock waves through Shelton, beneath the earth. Hastily buried and camouflaged with branches were the decomposing remains of Thomas and Irene Holloway, a local couple who had vanished nearly a month earlier. Though there had been initial concern, most assumed the Holloways had taken an unannounced vacation. After all, they were wealthy. and one of the few families in Shelton who had prospered, while others struggled. But now the truth was evident and horrifying. As investigators traced the Holloway's final movements, a grim pattern emerged. They'd been spotted the same day Jim was seen filling up at the station. Surveillance footage from the local bank showed the couple withdrawing a large sum of cash that was never recovered. Their home had no signs of forced entry, but their car had vanished, only to be found abandoned days later on a remote logging road, stripped of anything valuable. Suspicion quickly turned to Jim Lt. Auntie claimed he was home the night the hop disappeared, but neighbors reported hearing his truck rumble down the road long after midnight. Still, without hard evidence, the case stalled until police searched Jim's property. In his shed, buried beneath rusted scrap metal, they found a small box. Inside, a wad of cash, watches, and jewelry, some of it unmistakably belonging to Irene Holloway. Blood traces, invisible to the naked eye, were found in the bed of Jim's truck and the soil on his boots. A perfect match to the gravesite. Jim was arrested. At trial, he remained eerily calm. His defense argued he had simply found the items in the woods. But the evidence told another story, one of obsession, envy, and premeditated violence. When the guilty verdict was read, Jim showed no reaction, no anger, no regret, just a hollow stare. He was sentenced to life without parole. Shelton tried to move on. But how do you heal from something like that? Even years later, people still speak of the Holloways in hushed voices. Their once grand home sits empty, perched on a hill, a decaying monument to lost lives. Ivy has overtaken the wrought iron gates. Irene's beloved flower beds are now wild with weeds. No one dares to enter. No one wants to remember. Rumors continue to swirl. Some believe Jim had killed before. Others whisper that he didn't act alone, that someone helped him, and that person still lives among them. Police dismissed the theories, but in Shelton, the fear never fully faded. Jim Etten remains behind bars, hundreds of miles from the town he once called home. He never spoke of motive, never confessed. But maybe he didn't need to. The town already knew. It was greed, resentment, the belief that he had been cheated out of a better life. And in trying to take what he thought he deserved, Jim lost everything. Such theories may have tried to offer closure, but they couldn't erase the unease that had settled over Shelton like a heavy morning fog. For months after the trial, paranoia clung to the town like ivy on brick. People began double-checking their locks, something unheard of before. Guns were purchased, security cameras installed, and for the first time in its quiet history, Shelton felt like a town at war with its own shadow. But as time passed, the whispers faded. Life moved on, as it always does. Businesses reopened. Children played in the streets. Slowly, the town began to mend. The Holloway house stood abandoned and untouched, a silent monument to the horror that once occurred within. And the woods, where their bodies were found, became a place to avoid, a patch of land swallowed by silence. Life carried forward, but the tragedy left behind an invisible scar one only those who had lived through it could see. The story should have ended there. Jim Eaton locked away for life. Shelton returning to its peaceful rhythm. The Holloways resting in peace. But in the fall of 2002, 5 years after the murders, something happens, something that reopened every wound Shelton had tried so desperately to heal. It began with a hunter. William Gentry was not a man easily shaken, a lifelong Shelton resident. He knew the woods like the back of his hand. He'd been hunting since he was a boy, and had spent more nights under the trees than most spent in their homes. But nothing could have prepared him for what he stumbled upon that crisp October morning. The air was sharp, the kind of cold that bites through skin. Deer had been scarce that season, so William had pushed deeper into the forest than usual, toward the old, forgotten logging trails. And that's when he saw it, something off in the terrain. A patch of earth that looked wrong. At first he thought it was just a branch that had disrupted the natural flow of the ground. But as he stepped closer, he knew better. The soil had been disturbed recently. It was loose, uneven. Someone had buried something there, and then the smell hit him. It was the stench of death, one he'd encountered before. But this was different. Fresher, stronger, sharper, heart-pounding. He backed away and called the police. Within hours, the area was crawling with investigators. What they uncovered sent shockwaves through Shelton. Once again, beneath the disturbed soil lay a body. Female, mid to late 20s, recently killed. She had been bound and strangled and buried in a shallow grave. But it wasn't just the murder itself that chilled authorities. It was the way it had been done. The precision, the staging. It was identical to the Holloway murders. But Jim Lton was still in prison. The news cracked open the fragile sense of security Shelton had tried to rebuild. The case was supposed to be closed, the killer caught, but now it seemed the nightmare had never truly ended. If Jim hadn't acted alone, then who was still out there? Was there an accomplice? Or worse, had the town imprisoned the wrong man? Theories spread like wildfire. Some believed Jim had manipulated the system, faking guilt to shield someone else. Others feared a more horrifying truth, that they had convicted an innocent man, and the real killer had remained free all along. Investigators dove into the new victim's life. Her name was Melissa Carter. No known ties to Shelton. She had been passing through, staying at a roadside motel on the town's edge, but her presence just days before her death felt too coincidental. Then came the chilling clue. Police reviewed the motel's security footage from the night Melissa vanished. The image was grainy, the man's face partially obscured, but one detail stood out: a work jacket. The same kind worn by Shelton's former logging crews. The same kind Jim Lton had worn the day he was arrested. As the investigation deepened, Shelton spiraled once more. Had they been wrong all along? Had the justice system failed them? Then came the most damning revelation. As authorities re-examined Jim Lton's case, digging through every shred of evidence, they discovered a crucial oversight, something that should have never been missed. The DNA found on one of Irene Holloway's stolen belongings, a key piece of the prosecution's case, had never been definitively matched to Jim. The technology at the time had only confirmed a possible match, not a conclusive one. The rest of the case had been circumstantial: Jim's known resentment, his past aggression, the stolen items in his possession. But had they ever proven he was the killer? It seemed they hadn't. The discovery rocked the town and the legal system. Jim's lawyers filed for an appeal immediately, arguing that the new findings cast serious doubt on his conviction. And beneath all the legal arguments and emotional chaos, one horrifying truth began to sink in. If Jim was innocent, the real killer had been free for 5 years. Fear returned to Shelton like a winter storm. As the appeal process unfolded, the investigation into Melissa Carter's murder intensified. Authorities reopened every file on the Holloway case. Witnesses were re-interviewed, evidence re-examined. What had they missed? And then, just weeks after Melissa's body was discovered, another was found. This time, it was a man. Samuel Dwyer, a long-haul trucker, had been passing through Shelton. He'd checked into a different roadside motel on November 12th. By the 14th, he had vanished. A week later, his body was found in the same remote stretch of woods where Melissa had been buried, bound, strangled, carefully positioned, exactly like Melissa Carter, exactly like the Holloways. The killer hadn't stopped. They'd just been waiting. And now, with each new body, Shelton was forced to confront a terrifying truth. Their worst nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. The bodies had been deliberately posed, carefully arranged, almost ritualistic. The pattern was undeniable. A serial killer was hunting in Shelton. Detectives scrambled for answers. If Jim Lton wasn't the killer, then who was? Could there have been 2 murderers all along? Or worse, was someone mimicking Jim's crimes, replicating every grim detail. The FBI was called in. Profilers examined the evidence, building a psychological portrait. They concluded the killer had intimate knowledge of Shelton, likely someone local. The murders were methodical, calculated. This wasn't a person who killed on impulse. This was someone who selected victims with care and savored the process. Then came a strange twist. Samuel Dwyer, though he had no direct connection to Shelton. He'd worked for a trucking company that delivered to the region in the late 90s. Delivery records revealed he'd stopped in Shelton at least 3 times in the months leading up to the Holloway murders. It was a thin link, but enough to raise suspicion. Digging deeper, investigators found something chilling. Right before he disappeared, Dwyer had made a call to a now disconnected number. That call had originated from a payphone near a roadside diner just outside Shelton. Witnesses remembered him that night, looking over his shoulder, anxious, like someone being followed. Who had he been calling, and what did he know? Then, the case took a stunning turn. Jim Elton's appeal was granted. A judge ruled that the forensic evidence used to convict him had been fundamentally flawed. His defense argued that without a definitive DNA match, the conviction had relied almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. After 17 years behind bars, Jim Eaton walked free. His release shook Shelton to its core. Some still clung to the belief in his guilt. Others began to question everything. If Jim hadn't committed the murders, the real killer had been free for nearly 2 decades. Vaughn was still out there, with no choice. The police reopened the Holloway investigation. Every old suspect, every neighbor, every person who had ever come near the Holloways. That's when they uncovered a name buried in the original files overlooked. Barely investigated. Daniel Frazier. Back in 1997, Daniel had been a local handyman. He'd done odd jobs for several families, including the Holloways. He had access to their home, knew their routines, and vanished from Shelton just months after the murders. Detectives tracked him down in a small town in Oregon, but the man they found wasn't Daniel Frazier, at least not anymore. He was living under a new name, working as a truck mechanic, hiding in plain sight. When they searched his home, the facade crumbled. Inside were newspaper clippings about the Holloway murders, about Jim Elton's trial, about Shelton, and then objects belonging to the victims. A locket that once belonged to Irene Holloway, her husband's wristwatch, and the most damning piece, Melissa Carter's motel key, still attached to its plastic tag. He had kept souvenirs, trophies. Daniel Frazier hadn't left his past behind. He had watched from a distance as Shelton moved on, convinced Jim was the killer. When no one was looking, he returned and started again. Police arrested Daniel without resistance. He never said a word. He simply sat in silence, as if he already knew it was over. But the DNA, silent as it was, spoke volumes. The unidentified profile once thought to be Jim Elton's, a perfect match to Daniel Frazier. The real killer had finally been caught. Shelton exhaled in collective relief, but the wounds ran deep. Jim Elton had lost 17 years for a crime he didn't commit. The Holloways died without justice, and 2 more lives were taken in the years since. Daniel Frazier was convicted of 4 counts of murder and sentenced to life without parole. But for many in Shelton, that wasn't enough. They had lived in false comfort, believing their nightmare had ended long ago. Lee to realize the killer had never left. Still, there was finally closure. The past had caught up to its ghost, and Shelton could begin to heal. Case 6. The Fall of Richard Calloway. The morning was bitter, the kind that clings to the skin like frost. In Detroit, the sky hung low-gray, heavy, lifeless. For most, it was just another cold day. But for one man, it was the beginning of the end. Richard "Rick" Calloway had always chased power. Born in 1974 in Grand Rapids, Michigan, he grew up in the shadows of factories, surrounded by grease, metal, and grit. His father worked long shifts on the auto lines. His mother juggled jobs to keep the family afloat. But Rick had no intention of following in their footsteps. He wanted more status, wealth, control. By his 20s, Rick had reinvented himself. The working-class boy was now a self-styled mogul. He wore custom suits, drove foreign cars, and sold himself as a visionary entrepreneur. Behind the curtain, though, was a man without morals. Rick's empire was built on lies, fake real estate projects, fraudulent investments, and shell companies used to launder money. He manipulated investors with charisma and robbed them blind. For years he evaded justice, leaving no fingerprints, hiding in plain sight. Then came 2008. The financial collapse rattled every corner of the economy. And Rick, he was finally cornered. Banks tightened their grip. Investors demanded answers. And Rick had nothing left but desperation. Then people started disappearing. In February, Daniel Haro, a small-time investor, vanished. He'd last been seen leaving his downtown Detroit office. His car sat untouched. His phone went dead. His family knew something was wrong as detectives retraced Daniel's final days. One name surfaced: Rick Calloway. Daniel had poured his life savings into one of Rick's projects, a luxury development in Ann Arbor. But when investigators looked into the deal, they found nothing. No permits, no blueprints, no land. The project didn't exist. Then came the break. A construction crew, clearing snow on a rural lot, uncovered a shallow grave. Buried beneath the frozen earth was Daniel. His hands were bound, his skull fractured, his face unrecognizable, but near the body. Detectives found a small scrap of suit-lining fabric, traced to one of Rick's favorite custom jackets, and the dam broke. More victims came forward. More stories of manipulation, coercion, and financial ruin. Rick had intimidated partners, threatened whistleblowers, hollowed out every life he touched. The man who had once walked in the halls of power now found himself shackled, his empire crumbling. But this was only the beginning. The walls were closing in, and Rick Calloway knew it. For years he had thrived in the shadows, weaving a complex web of fraud, laundering millions through a labyrinth of shell corporations, and charming his way through high-profile circles. But the discovery of Daniel Haro's body changed everything now. For the first time, Rick faced a threat he couldn't manipulate, charm, or buy his way out of. The Michigan State Police, working closely with the FBI, ramped up their investigation. Rick's name, once murmured discreetly in boardrooms and whispered among ruined investors, was suddenly everywhere, on headlines, in news tickers, and flashing across television screens. The golden image of a financial genius was crumbling fast, unraveling thread by thread to reveal the rot beneath. Still, Rick maintained his polished front. He smiled for the cameras at exclusive events, shook hands with confidence, and brushed off reporters as if the storm swirling around him was nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. But inside, the paranoia festered. He knew the pattern. First came the media, then the investigators, and finally, the fall. Rick had no intention of waiting around for that final act. The night of March 18, 2008, was brutally cold, with a late-season snowstorm covering Michigan roads in sheets of ice. But not even the weather could derail Rick's escape. Ever the strategist, he had planned every detail. In the days leading up to his departure, he'd quietly liquidated assets, transferred funds to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, sold his Detroit penthouse under an alias, and tucked away stacks of cash in safety deposit boxes across the state. His fake passport, under the name Gregory Langston, was ready. His destination, Chicago, where a private jet waited at a discreet, unregulated airstrip. He avoided major highways, switched vehicles mid-route, and used burner phones to stay off the grid. By the end of the week, he told himself he'd be sipping whiskey in Dubai untouchable. But Rick had made two fatal miscalculations: his own arrogance and the determination of those he had wronged. As he navigated a desolate stretch near the Michigan-Indiana border, a pair of headlights appeared in his rearview mirror. At first, he dismissed it, but the vehicle stayed close, matching his every move. Unease crept in. He accelerated. So did the car behind him. His gut tightened. Law enforcement, a private investigator, a vengeful investor. Before he could decide, the pursuing car surged ahead and cut him off with chilling precision. Rick slammed the brakes, his tires screeching against the icy road. He barely avoided a crash. Then a second SUV appeared, this one emerging from the opposite direction. It blocked the road completely. He was trapped. With trembling fingers, Rick reached into the glove compartment for the handgun he had never wanted to use. He wasn't a violent man. His strength had always been manipulation, not force. But he knew men like him didn't survive long without insurance. A figure stepped out from the lead vehicle, dressed in black, face obscured in the dim light. Rick gripped the weapon tighter. He had two choices: surrender or fight. Rick Calloway had never been one to surrender. He flung open his door and raised the gun, but he wasn't fast enough. A gunshot rang out. Pain ripped through his shoulder as the bullet struck, sending him sprawling onto the icy road. His weapon clattered out of reach. Rick gasped, panic overriding the agony. He tried to crawl backward, slipping on the frozen pavement, desperate to escape. Then came the second shot. A passing motorist discovered Rick Calloway's body 3 days later, half buried in snow beside his abandoned vehicle. Blood stained the white ground in chilling contrast. The autopsy revealed 2 gunshot wounds, one to the shoulder, one to the head, an execution-style killing, not a random act of violence. The news stunned the public. Law enforcement scrambled to untangle what had happened. The timing was too perfect. Had a wronged investor taken justice into their own hands? Had someone from Rick's own network silenced him to cover their tracks? The snow had wiped away tire marks and footprints. No shell casings were found, and despite an intensive investigation, no arrests were made. Rick Calloway had built an empire on deceit and left behind only ruins. His estate was seized, his assets frozen, and his name reduced to a cautionary tale. A man who had once flown high, brought down by the very lies that had lifted him, yet the whispers never stopped. Some claimed the secret syndicate had orchestrated his execution. Others believed one of his own inner circle had turned on him. And still others said this wasn't about revenge or money. It was justice delivered by unseen hands when the system failed. Because no matter how carefully Rick had planned his escape, there was one thing he could never outrun: the consequences of his sins. The bullets that ended Rick Calloway's life left no evidence behind, no markings, no traceable origin. Whoever orchestrated his execution had done so with surgical precision. Despite their best efforts, law enforcement was left chasing shadows, and as the years wore on, the case quietly slipped from the public's memory. But behind closed doors, in darkened boardrooms and cryptic phone calls those who had once shared Rick Calloway's world knew the truth. Because justice in this case hadn't come from a courtroom. It came from those who had suffered in silence for far too long. To understand why Rick met such a brutal end, we need to look back to the years that led to that final night along the Michigan-Indiana border. Rick Calloway was born into a modest family in Grand Rapids. From a young age, he was intelligent, charismatic, and relentless in his hunger for power. But he lacked one essential quality: integrity. In the 1990s, Rick launched his career as a financial consultant. He quickly became a rising star in Michigan's elite circles. With his confident persona and polished charm, people trusted him often without question. By the early 2000s, Rick had built a financial empire. On the surface, it promised high returns and exclusive opportunities. But beneath the gleaming surface, his empire was a house of cards held. together by a tangled web of shell corporations and fraudulent accounts. Rick preyed on both the wealthy and the desperate, selling dreams of financial security only to leave them penniless. By the mid-2000s, he had amassed millions, but every con has a deadline. That deadline came sooner than Rick expected. The first major crack in his operation came when Daniel Harrow, a longtime associate, threatened to go to the authorities. Daniel had grown disillusioned with Rick's greed. He had evidence, real damning evidence, but he underestimated how far Rick would go to protect his empire. Days after confronting him, Daniel vanished. His body was discovered 6 months later in the basement of an abandoned warehouse in Detroit, bound, lifeless, officially ruled a homicide, but no one could prove it. Still, everyone in Rick's circle knew the truth, and that was just the beginning of the end. By 2007, whispers of Rick Calloway's crimes had begun leaking beyond his inner circle. Investigators started to piece together fragments of his operation. Federal agencies were closing in, but at the same time, something far more dangerous was unfolding. Among those Rick had defrauded were powerful figures, people who lived and operated far outside the bounds of the law. These weren't the kind to file lawsuits. These were people who enforced their own brand of justice, quiet, efficient, and absolute. People who had trusted Rick not just with their money, but with their secrets, and he had betrayed them all. Rick had always believed he could outwit anyone, but he failed to realize that he wasn't the only predator in the game. By the time he understood that he was being hunted by both the FBI and the very people he had wronged, it was already too late. The night of March 18, 2008, wasn't random. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was a planned execution. The men who followed him that night weren't there to warn him or negotiate. They came to end him, and they did. As Rick bled out in the snow, his mind raced not with panic, but disbelief. For so long, he had believed he was untouchable, that money could fix anything, that he could always find a way out. But as one of the masked figures stepped forward, the one who fired the final shot, finally saw the truth. There are some debts money can't repay, some betrayals that can't be undone. The muzzle of the gun hovered above him for just a second, if offering a moment of clarity. Then, the trigger was pulled. The shot echoed through the night, and just like that, Rick Calloway, the man who climbed to the top by stepping on everyone beneath him, was no more. For weeks, investigators chased every lead. They were determined to bring his killers to justice. But the trail led nowhere. Highway surveillance showed nothing conclusive. Witnesses offered conflicting accounts, and those who might have known the truth, they stayed silent. This was a crime executed by ghosts, by people who had no intention of being found, and so, with time, the case went cold. Rick Calloway's name disappeared from the headlines. His estate was liquidated. His empire collapsed, and his death became a whisperer, cautionary tale in the world of power and deception. Some say justice had finally been served, just not by the law. Others argue his killers were no better than him. That murder is never justified, no matter how corrupt the victim. But one truth stands. Rick Calloway built his world on lies, and in the end, that world crumbled beneath him. Case 7 in the quiet city of Namyangju, South Korea, nestled in the serene landscape of Gyeonggi Province. Life in 2010 moved at a peaceful, almost predictable pace. The community was proud of its low crime rate and close-knit neighborhoods. That peace shattered on November 17, 2010. Mrs. Lee, a 69-year-old resident of a newly constructed apartment complex, was found brutally murdered in her home. Her husband, Mr. Park, discovered her body after returning from an early morning round of golf. Mrs. Lee had been stabbed multiple times. The fatal wound severed her carotid artery. The sheer violence of the crime stunned the communities, especially given the building's high-tech security system. Entry was electronically logged. Access was strictly controlled. Yet there were no signs of forced entry. no records of unauthorized access. How, then, could such a horrific murder occur in a seemingly impenetrable fortress? Mrs. Lee was well known and well liked. She actively participated in community center events for the elderly. She followed a regular routine and had spoken to a friend that very morning about attending a gathering. She had shown no signs of fear or unusual behavior. Detectives meticulously searched the apartment, but found no usable forensic evidence. No fingerprints, no DNA, no signs of a struggle. The murder weapon was missing. Nothing was stolen. Robbery was ruled out. Investigators turned to security footage. Hours of surveillance video were reviewed, but no suspicious persons were recorded entering or leaving during the critical time frame. Residents were interviewed, but no one had seen or heard anything unusual. The case quickly gained national attention. The media dubbed it the Namyangju locked room murder. Theories ranged from a professional hit to supernatural involvement. There was no evidence to support any of them. As the days passed, detectives looked deeper into Mrs. Lee's life. Her financial records were clean. Her relationships were warm and stable. There were no enemies, no grudges, nothing to suggest a motive. Attention then shifted to her husband. As the spouse and the one who found the body, Mr. Park was scrutinized intensely, but his alibi held up. Witnesses confirmed his presence at the golf club. There was no forensic link between him and the crime. Friends and family vouched for the couple's close, loving relationship. The investigation hit a wall, with no suspect, no motive, and no physical evidence. The murder of Mrs. Lee remains one of South Korea's most baffling unsolved cases. A locked room mystery that continues to haunt the quiet city of Namyangju, with traditional avenues exhausted. The investigative team began exploring more unconventional possibilities. Could the perpetrator have possessed inside knowledge of the building's security infrastructure? This line of questioning led them to examine the construction crew and security personnel associated with the apartment complex. Background checks were conducted, and interviews followed, but once again, no viable suspects emerged. The lack of progress began to weigh heavily on the community. Residents who once felt secure in their homes now lived under a cloud of unease. Neighborhood meetings were held, private security was tightened, and a collective anxiety settled in. As the first anniversary of Mrs. Lee's death approached, the case remained unsolved. It was quietly reassigned to the cold case unit, where detectives would periodically revisit it, hoping new evidence or advancements in forensic technology might one day break the silence. The Namyangju locked room murder became a grim chapter in the city's history, a chilling reminder of how fragile the illusion of safety can be, and how the most impenetrable doors can still hide sinister truths. Years passed, but the mystery refused to fade. The case drew attention from criminologists, forensic experts, and amateur sleuths alike. Despite the time that had elapsed, the desire to uncover the truth remained strong. New developments in forensic science prompted a re-examination of the crime scene. Investigators revisited the apartment, applying advanced techniques to detect trace evidence that may have previously gone unnoticed. Yet the scene remained frustratingly pristine. No signs of struggle, no DNA, nothing conclusive. Investigators even looked outward, comparing the case to similar crimes on a national and international scale. A handful of incidents bore superficial similarities, but none offered the breakthrough they desperately needed. Psychological profilers were brought in to construct a potential portrait of the killer, but it led nowhere. By 2015, the case was officially categorized as a cold case, though it was never fully closed. The murder had become something of an urban legend in Namyangju, a whispered warning of the darkness that could exist behind even the most secure walls. Some residents moved away, unable to shake the dread that the killer had never truly left, that they might have passed him in the hallway, that he still lived among them. But time, as always, has a way of loosening the tightest knots. In late 2016, an unexpected lead surfaced. Not from forensic evidence, but from an unlikely source. A low-level cybercriminal, arrested in Seoul for credit card fraud, made an offhand remark during interrogation that immediately caught the attention of investigators. The suspect, Choi Sang-won, mentioned he once knew a man who bragged about pulling off a perfect crime in Namyeongju years earlier. A man who could get into places without ever being seen. At first, it sounded like drunken bravado, the kind of empty talk that circulated in shady bars and underground forums. But then Choi said something chillingly specific. The crime involved an apartment with high-tech security, no forced entry, and no sounds of struggle. The match was too precise to ignore. Authorities began combing through Choi's associations, looking for someone with the skill set to breach modern security systems undetected. Eventually, one name stood out: Eugene Suk, a former security consultant. Suk had once been a rising star in the field, designing access control systems for high-rise buildings and corporate offices. His deep knowledge of system vulnerabilities made him valuable, but also dangerous. In 2011, shortly after Mrs. Lee's murder, he vanished from the corporate world under suspicious circumstances. An internal audit had accused him of secretly installing backdoor access points into residential security networks, a charge he denied at the time. But now, the timing looked far too coincidental. Digging deeper, investigators discovered Suk hadn't disappeared. He'd simply gone underground. He had begun working within Seoul's criminal underworld, offering his expertise to those willing to pay: burglars, corporate spies, and private clients with dark intentions. Was it possible that Eugene Suk had used his skills to enter Mrs. Lee's apartment undetected? And if so, why her? Cybercrime units retraced Suk's digital footprint, scanning financial transactions, communication logs, and old employment records. Then came a shocking discovery. Suk had been directly involved in the early design and implementation of the very security system used in Mrs. Lee's apartment complex. Though he had left the project before its completion, his fingerprints were all over its foundations. Investigators began reviewing the original 2010 system logs, which at the time had SHOWN, no unauthorized entries. But with modern forensic tools, analysts uncovered a nearly invisible anomaly: a brief keycard access that had been logged and then deleted. The deletion had been buried deep within system logs, practically undetectable. Someone had entered Mrs. Lee's apartment and then erased the evidence, and the method used. It matched known techniques attributed to Eugene Suk. It was the first concrete lead in 6 years. Surveillance teams soon traced Suk to Busan, living under an assumed name. A sting operation was launched. Undercover agents posed as clients needing help bypassing a high-security system. After weeks of careful planning, the trap was set. Asterisk, when Suk arrived at the designated meeting point, expecting a job, he instead found himself surrounded by plainclothes officers. In custody, Suk at first denied everything. He admitted to working on security systems and even to engaging in illegal bypasses for private clients, but insisted he had never committed violence. Confronted with the erased logs, his connection to the building, and Choi's damning testimony, Suk went silent. For 36 hours, he said nothing. Then finally, in a hushed voice, he broke. "I never meant for her to die," he whispered. The room fell still. Investigators leaned in. Suk looked down at his cuffed hands, then, as if finally surrendering to the truth, began to speak. He claimed he had been hired by an anonymous client. The instructions were simple: break into Mrs. Lee's apartment on the night of November 4th, 2010, retrieve a specific item, and leave no trace. He refused to say who had hired Jim, insisting he didn't know. All he knew was that the job was urgent and that he had been paid handsomely in advance. Using a hidden backdoor exploit he had programmed into the building's security system years earlier, he slipped into the apartment without triggering a single alarm. The entry was precise, coldly calculated. He'd timed it for the early hours of the morning, when Mrs. Lee was almost certainly asleep. A pale blue glow from the city filtered through the windows as he moved through the darkened apartment, searching methodically. He rifled through drawers, cabinets, and shelves, eyes scanning for whatever his client wanted. But then a sound, a rustle, a shift in the bed. He froze. When he turned, he saw her, Mrs. Lee's silhouette, barely visible in the dim light. She had woken up. For a brief second, neither of them moved. Then she screamed. Panic surged through him. He lunged forward, clamping a gloved hand over her mouth, whispering frantically for her to be quiet. But she fought back, scratching, twisting. Beneath him, muffled cries pressed against his palm. In his desperation to silence her, he pressed harder. Inside were journals, pages and pages of handwritten entries, one detailing a different crime, each dated, each written with disturbing precision. He wrote about stalking his victims, learning their patterns, manipulating their routines, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. One passage chilled investigators to the core. Control is everything, watching them from a distance, learning their habits, knowing where they will be before they do. That is true power. Writings revealed not just cruelty, but obsession. A methodical, calculated hunt. A man who saw himself as a puppeteer, pulling the strings from behind the curtain. To this day, Kang Ju-win has never been found. He remains one of South Korea's most wanted fugitives, and one of its most terrifying mysteries. A ghost in the city, a predator hidden in routine, a man who lived two lives, one above ground, the other buried beneath it. And in Busan, a city that once celebrated its lights, a shadow still lingers. Case 9, The Shadow of Busan, the story of Kang Jun-dae. Most chilling realization came when investigators uncovered just how long Kang Jun had been active. The earliest entry in his journals dated back to 2003, years before the body of his final known victim was discovered in the Nong alleyway. This revelation expanded the scope of his crimes exponentially. It now appeared that many more missing persons could be connected to him than initially suspected. Faced with mounting evidence, authorities had no choice but to classify Kang Jun as one of the most dangerous fugitives in South Korean history. A nationwide manhunt was launched, and the media quickly dubbed him the Shadow of Busan, a name that would instill fear throughout the country. Parents began keeping their children indoors. Women avoided walking alone at night. Even hardened detectives admitted they had never encountered a case so unnerving. Then, months after Jae-yoon vanished, a potential lead surfaced. Surveillance footage from outside a convenience store in Jangwaya City, several hours from Busan, captured a man in a dark hoodie and face mask, standing near an ATM. His posture, build, and eyes bore a striking resemblance to Jae-yoon. Authorities were dispatched immediately, but by the time they arrived, he was already gone. What puzzled investigators most was how he managed to stay hidden. He had no known allies, no family willing to assist him, and no visible means of income. Yet time and again, he slipped through the cracks, as if he had anticipated this pursuit long before his crimes were discovered. As months turned into years, sightings dwindled. Some speculated he had escaped to the countryside, living off the grid. Others believed he had fled the country entirely, using a forged identity. Then, nearly 2 years after his disappearance, a discovery shattered the silence. A group of urban explorers came across a decaying house on the outskirts of Olan, near Busan. Drawn in by rumors of hauntings, they expected dust and cobwebs. Instead, they stumbled into a nightmare. Inside was chaos: old newspapers, empty food containers, and the overwhelming stench of rot. In the middle of the living room was a makeshift cat, surrounded by notebooks, identical to those found in Jian's former apartment. But what lay beyond was even worse. Behind a concealed door at the back of the house, they found a narrow staircase leading to a dimly lit basement. There sat an old wooden desk covered in photographs. Some were of missing women, their faces circled in red ink. Others showed various locations across Busan, annotated with cryptic notes. In one of the notebooks, a chilling final entry read, "They're close. I can feel it, but they'll never truly understand. Not until it's too late." By the time authorities arrived, the house was empty. No food, no fresh footprints, no sign he had been there recently. Yet one thing was certain, he had been watching. Years passed. The name Kang Jun resurfaced occasionally in news segments and retrospectives, but no solid leads ever emerged. For the families of his victims, closure remained a cruel illusion. Some held on to hope that he would be caught. Others believed he had died somewhere in obscurity, taking his secrets to the grave. Then, in the winter of 2022, a grim discovery was made. In Busan, construction workers demolishing an abandoned commercial building near Hyundai Beach unearthed human remains in the basement. At first, police believed it was likely a homeless man who had taken shelter there, but forensic analysis painted a different picture. The body belonged to a male in his late 40s. He showed signs of severe malnutrition and had multiple self-inflicted wounds. But it was the personal items found near the remains that changed everything. A rusted pocket knife, a worn leather-bound journal, and an old faded ID card bearing the name Kang Ji-yoon. The revelation stunned the nation. He had never left Busan, never crossed borders. Instead, he had buried himself in the city's forgotten places, ruins of the very streets he once hunted on. The journal offered a final, haunting insight into his final years. "They're always watching. Even when I'm alone, they are there. I can hear them in the wind, in the walls, in the silence. There is no escape. Not anymore." Justice, it seemed, had come for Kang Jun in the only way it could, through the torment of his own guilt. The case was officially closed, but the scars he left on Busan would not fade easily. To this day, locals still remember the shadow of Busan, not as a myth, not as a ghost story, but as a reminder that true monsters often live unnoticed, hiding in plain sight until it's far too late. Choi Min-sik had built his fortune with patience and precision, the result of years of calculated investments and tireless work. That evening, he'd been attending a private celebration at a friend's home, toasting to a recent business victory. When he left, just after midnight, he had no idea someone was following him. That someone was Kang Ju-eun. Ju-eun had once been a dock worker, scraping by on odd jobs and long hours at Yosu's bustling port. But life had dealt him blow after blow, missed opportunities, failed ventures, and a bitterness that had hardened into quiet rage. That night, it all came to a head. In a dimly lit alley near the harbor, Jae-yoon confronted Choi. He demanded money, compensation, as he saw it, for the life he believed Choi had stolen from him. But Choi had little on him, just a wallet and a few credit cards. The confrontation turned violent quickly, violently, irreversibly. Overcome by years of resentment, Jae-yoon struck him repeatedly, each blow driven by desperation rather than reason. It was over in moments. Choi lay lifeless on the wet pavement. Jae-yoon fled into the night, unaware of the trail he had left behind. The body was discovered early the next morning by a street vendor setting up near the docks. The vendor froze when he spotted the body slumped against the alley wall, his face, swollen and bloodied, barely recognizable. Trembling, he called the police. Detective Park San-ho was one of the first on the scene. A veteran investigator with decades on the force, Park had seen his share of violence, but not in Yosu, not like this. The scene immediately struck him as suspicious. Choi's pockets were turned inside out, his wallet nearby, but a luxury watch worth millions of won was still on his wrist. This wasn't a random mugging. This was personal. The forensic team worked methodically. The wounds indicated a struggle, but the sheer brutality suggested something far more emotional. Investigators turned to security footage and quickly found a clue. Choi leaving the party at midnight, and a shadowy figure in a fisherman's jacket, trailing him just minutes before the estimated time of death. Word spread quickly through Yosu's tight-knit fishing community. One name surfaced almost immediately: Kang Juin. Juin had been spiraling in the weeks before the murder, drinking more, loitering outside Choi's office, muttering about debts and betrayal. Most telling of all, he was spotted trying to pawn an expensive leather briefcase the day after the murder. Police executed a search warrant at Jian's rundown apartment near the docks. Inside, they found Choi's missing credit cards, hidden in an old tackle box. But that wasn't all. Beneath a pile of clothes, officers discovered a notebook, its pages filled with obsessive scrawlings about power, revenge, and reclaiming what was rightfully his. Choi's name appeared over and over, underlined with angry strokes. That evening, they found Jion sitting alone at the edge of the docks, staring out at the water. He didn't resist arrest. He didn't say a word. The trial moved swiftly. Prosecutors depicted Jion as a bitter man, driven to violence by his own failures. The defense argued it was a spontaneous act, not premeditated. But the evidence was overwhelming. Jion was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. As he was led from the courtroom, he kept his eyes on the floor, not once glancing at the reporters, the judge, or Choi's grieving family. He looked like a man already lost to himself. Yosu moved on. The alley was cleaned, the blood washed away by rain and time. Tourists returned, the fishermen cast their nets. But the story remained, passed in hushed tones. A cautionary tale of how bitterness, envy, and despair could twist a man beyond recognition. Years passed, but the pain lingered for Choi's family. His parents, once full of life, aged quickly. His younger sister Uni, once a promising student, drifted under the weight of grief. The world expected them to move on, but grief has no expiration date. In prison, Jiun withered. He raged at first, refusing food, lashing out, but time wore him down. His fire faded, replaced by something hollow. And yet, questions remained. Jiun had confessed, but some things didn't add up. The autopsy report revealed wounds that suggested a second attacker. Witnesses recalled seeing more than one shadow moving in the alley that night. Still, no other suspect was ever charged. Detective Park Sanho, now retired, couldn't let it go. His instincts screamed that the case wasn't as simple as it seemed. He returned to the files, every testimony, every photograph, every overlooked detail. And that's when he found it. A trace of blood that didn't belong to either Choi or Jiun. Someone else had been there. Park dug deeper. He contacted old colleagues, revisited dusty records. Eventually, one name rose to the surface: Young Woo-sik, known to most as WK, a former co-worker of Jian's, a man with a violent past who had vanished shortly after Jian's arrest. Park tracked him to Busan, living under a new name. WK was thinner now, older, tired. He denied everything at first, but when confronted with the forensics and witness reports, something shifted. He didn't confess, but he didn't need to. The guilt was all over his face. Park returned to Yosu and presented his findings. Some officials were reluctant to reopen a case they believed was long settled, but pressure mounted. A new investigation was launched, and this time, the city was watching. The truth had been buried beneath years of silence, shame, and assumption. Jaeyoon wasn't innocent, but he wasn't alone. And for Choi's family, the emergence of W name brought both pain and a sliver of long-denied justice. The docks of Yosu remain quiet, but beneath the surface, the echoes of that night still linger. A brutal reminder of what desperation can drive a man to do, and how the past, no matter how deeply buried, always has a way of returning. Case 9. The confession that changed everything. Under intense scrutiny during questioning, Woik finally cracked. He admitted to being in the alley the night Choi was killed and, more than that, He admitted that he and Ji-yoon had confronted Choi together. But the truth was darker than anyone had imagined. Ji-yoon hadn't planned to kill Choi. His intention had only been to scare him, maybe reclaim what he believed he was owed. But Wook had other plans. It was he who delivered the fatal blows. It was he who ensured Choi would never leave that alley alive. Overwhelmed with guilt, Ji-yoon had taken full responsibility, believing that his punishment was deserved for the greed and desperation that led him there. With Wook's confession, the puzzle was finally complete. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced. His fate now mirrored the one Ji-yoon had endured for years. But for Ji-yoon, the revelation came too late. By the time he learned the truth had finally come to light, his spirit was already broken. Years spent behind bars, believing he was a monster, had hollowed him out. Though justice had finally been served, it could never restore the time he had lost, the life that had been stripped away. Eventually, Ji-yoon was granted parole, but when the day of his release came, he hesitated. The world outside had moved on, transformed into something he no longer recognized. The city that once felt familiar was now alien. So he made a quiet, heartbreaking choice. Rather than stepping into a future filled with uncertainty, he stayed behind, choosing the prison walls that had become his only home. Yosu moved on. The city buried its past like footprints washed away by the tide. But for those who had lived through the pain and loss, the memory of that night remained a haunting reminder of desperation, greed, and the long, winding road to justice. Some wounds, after all, never truly heal. Case 10. The Quiet Mechanic. The Crimes of Ray Holloway. Wakefield, a quiet town nestled in West Yorkshire, carried the charm of history in its old streets and time-worn shops. To outsiders, it appeared peaceful and touched by the turbulence of modern life. Crime was rare, more a ripple than a wave in the calm of daily routine. But beneath that calm, shadows lingered. One of those shadows belonged to Raymond Ray Holloway. Born in 1972, Ray was the kind of man no one paid much attention to. He worked as a mechanic in a small garage on the outskirts of town, fixing up battered cars. With a wiry frame, thinning hair, and tired blue eyes, he looked older than his years. He lived alone in a modest flat, spent most evenings nursing pints at the same dimly lit pub, and never caused trouble. But those who looked closely, if anyone ever did, sensed that something about Ray was ... off. As a child, Ray had been unnervingly quiet. Teachers described him as withdrawn, disinterested in friendships. Raised by a single mother who worked long hours to make ends meet, Ray grew up without knowing what a family truly felt like. His father had vanished before he was born. By his teenage years, Ray had developed a strange habit collecting things. At first it was harmless: coins, trinkets, old watches, but over time, the collection turned darker. He became obsessed with newspaper clippings about disappearances and unsolved crimes, especially those from Yorkshire's shadowy past. He stored the articles in meticulously organized binders, studying them like sacred texts, as if searching for some hidden connection. To most, he was just another lonely man, living a quiet, unremarkable life. But behind that mundane exterior was a mind that had long crossed a line. The first incident connected to Ray Holloway occurred on a bitter November night in 2005. Allison Carter, a 23-year-old woman, vanished after leaving a local cafe. CCTV captured her walking toward her car, but she never made it home. The car was later found abandoned near a wooded area, doors unlocked, belongings untouched. No sign of a struggle, no hint of where she'd gone. It was as if she'd vanished into thin air. Investigators were baffled. Allison had no known enemies, no history of conflict. Her family was devastated. The community was shaken. Posters were plastered across town. Searches were launched, but weeks turned to months, and Allison's trail went cold. Ray Holloway was never questioned. He had no known connection to Allison, no reason to be suspected. Over the following years, other women disappeared in eerily similar ways. They didn't seem connected. Different backgrounds, different ages. Some cases were ruled as likely runaways. Others were simply left unsolved. But one chilling detail slipped past the eyes of investigators. All the women had at some point been in the same area where Ray Holloway's garage stood. Some had stopped in for repairs. Others had passed by. And each case occurred on nights when Ray was known to be working late. Still, no one put it together until 2011. A maintenance worker doing routine checks in an abandoned warehouse near the industrial edge of town stumbled across a disturbing find beneath the floorboards. A stash of clothing dresses, scarves, shoes, some folded with care, others crumpled, like they had been discarded quickly. And beneath them, fragments of bone, some wrapped in cloth, others left bare. The site was immediately sealed. Forensic teams arrived. DNA testing confirmed the worst fears. The remains belonged to Allison Carter and 2 other missing women. Wakefield, once proud of its sleepy charm, was plunged into chaos. The quiet town became the epicenter of a massive criminal investigation. Streets buzzed with panic. Newspapers churned out shocking headlines. Residents who once strolled home without a care now bolted their doors at dusk. Inside the warehouse, investigators uncovered even more. Dried blood embedded in the wooden beams, strands of hair trapped in floorboard cracks, and a notebook filled with eerily faceless sketches, some scratched out, others marked with dates. Ray Holloway was arrested soon after. He confessed to the murders with chilling detachment. There was no remorse, only a sense of twisted pride, as if he had become part of the dark mysteries he had once collected so obsessively. Ray was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But the horror he unleashed still lingers in Wakefield. For many residents, the shock never truly faded, and for the families of the victims, closure was an illusion. There could be no peace in the wake of such darkness. The case of Ray Holloway remains one of the most disturbing examples of evil hiding in plain sight. A reminder that sometimes it's not the monsters we fear most, but the quiet man we never notice. Case 10, The Secrets Beneath Wakefield. The hunt for Ray Holloway. What once seemed like isolated disappearances were now unmistakably linked. Dark thread weaving through the years, revealing a hidden pattern of predation. Investigators began mapping the last known locations of the missing women, tracing their movements, and with every step forward, one name kept surfacing: Ray Holloway. At first, the connections felt circumstantial. He had been working late on the nights several women vanished. His garage was situated near key disappearance sites. But the deeper they dug, the more disturbing the links became. Ray had once lived in a rented flat above the very warehouse where human remains were recently discovered. Old lease records confirmed he resided there during the same time Allison Carter had gone missing. Back then, a complaint had been lodged about a foul smell coming from his unit. It was dismissed as poor hygiene, but now, it painted a chilling picture. When police searched Ray's garage, tucked behind neat stacks of toolbox drawers and rows of half-repaired vehicles, they uncovered a concealed compartment in the rear storage room. Inside were items that stopped even the most seasoned investigators cold. Small, personal effects, mementos of lives lost. There was a necklace Allison Carter's family had once pleaded with the public to help identify. A keychain bearing a worn-down name, a diary with pages violently torn out. These weren't coincidences, they were trophies. Ray Holloway wasn't just a quiet man with a taste for crime novels. He had been scripting horrors of his own. His arrest came swiftly. Just past dawn, authorities stormed his flat, catching him in a moment of domestic stillness, seated on the couch, cup of tea in hand, watching late-night television. He didn't run, he didn't resist, as they cuffed him and read his rights. Ray simply nodded, as if he'd known this moment was inevitable. There were no outbursts, no denials. no struggle. By the time the morning news broke the story, the town of Wakefield was already buzzing. Reporters flocked to the scene. Neighbors expressed disbelief. How could the soft-spoken man who exchanged pleasantries at the pub be hiding such horror? Some felt validation. They had sensed something off about Ray for years. But the most chilling revelations were yet to come. Interrogators presented the evidence, piece by piece. Ray remained eerily composed, his voice measured, his responses deliberate. When asked about the warehouse, he confirmed he had lived above it, but denied ever accessing the storage below. Confronted with the recovered belongings, he shrugged. They could have belonged to anyone, he said. Then detectives brought up the notebook. The one found beneath the floorboards. Ray's face until now expressionless shifted ever so slightly. A flicker passed across his features. That was mine, he admitted. It was the first true confirmation they had. Inside the notebook were sketches faceless figures, each marked with a date. Forensic analysis revealed those dates matched the disappearances of at least 5 known victims. Each drawing bore a detail that tied it unmistakably to a real woman. A necklace, a scarf, a hairstyle. Still, Ray refused to confess. Detectives found his calm unnerving. No protests of innocence. No panic. Just a steady, unreadable stare. Then, without warning, he spoke. They were never supposed to be found. The words sent a chill through the room. The case against Ray Holloway was undeniable. The belongings, the drawings, the timeline, all pointed to the same grim conclusion. As his trial date approached, Wakefield was swallowed by media frenzy. Courtrooms were packed. Victims' families clutched hands in silent solidarity, hoping justice would ease even a fraction of their pain. Ray remained distant. He refused to speak in his own defense, never seeking mercy, never shifting blame. The prosecution delivered a devastating narrative, a man who preyed on vulnerable women and vanished them without a trace. A man who lived among them for years, undetected, who blended in so well he seemed forgettable till it was too late. When the verdict came guilty, life without parole, no one was surprised. Wakefield tried to breathe again, to return to normalcy, but the shadow Ray Holloway cast was long and heavy. Families of the victims found no real closure, only confirmation of what they feared. Their loved ones had suffered, had disappeared into silence. The truth, now revealed, brought pain sharper than the uncertainty. The warehouse where the remains had been discovered was eventually demolished, but the land beneath it carried a weight, an unspoken dread. Some townsfolk avoided it entirely. Others claimed they still felt something there, something unfinished. Ray Holloway faded quietly into prison life. He spoke of his crimes no further, never sought notoriety. It was as though he had made peace with his fate long before his capture. But one detail refused to fade. The notebook had contained more drawings than there were confirmed victims. There were still names unaccounted for, still missing women, still silent stories buried somewhere beneath Wakefield's quiet streets. The case was closed by law, but in the hearts of the families, the minds of investigators, and the whispers of the town, it was far from over. The darkness beneath Wakefield, the hidden legacy of Arthur Layton, the verdict was in. Ray Holloway was behind bars. The bodies had been found. The town of Wakefield tried to exhale, to let go of the horror that had haunted its streets. But the fear didn't lift. Instead, it lingered, settling into the very bones of the city, as if Wakefield itself had absorbed the weight of the evil that had flourished quietly for so long. And yet, the most disturbing question of all remained unanswered. The notebook, despite exhaustive investigation. Several sketches in that tattered book still had no names, no matching missing person reports, no identified remains. Stranger still, some of the entries dated back nearly 20 years, well before Ray Holloway had even set foot in Wakefield. Had he started earlier than anyone suspected? Or worse, had he not acted alone? Detective Sergeant Elaine Carter had led the case against Holloway from the beginning. It was her instincts that drove the arrest, her gaze that had locked with his as he uttered those chilling final words. They were never supposed to be found, but in the weeks that followed, Elaine found herself waking in the middle of the night, soaked in sweat, those words echoing relentlessly in her mind. Something about the case nagged at her. It had all come together too perfectly. Holloway had, hidden in plain sight for years, careful, meticulous, and yet, once the remains were uncovered, he had surrendered almost to his no fight, no denials, as if he'd expected it, almost welcomed it. Elaine dove back into the files long after the courtroom lights dimmed. She reviewed every statement, revisited the CCTV footage from the weeks leading up to the arrest, pored over interviews with Holloway's neighbors, his former co-workers. And then she found it, a forgotten detail, asterisk, buried deep in an old missing person report from 1999-15. Years before Ray Holloway ever moved to Wakefield. It was a witness statement, a brief account dismissed at the time as irrelevant, but it wasn't. An elderly woman named Edith Turner had reported seeing a man outside the abandoned warehouse, the same warehouse where the remains would one day be found. She described him as tall, broad-shouldered, with piercing dark eyes. He stood on the corner, watching the street with unsettling stillness. When she'd asked what he was doing, he had smiled and said, "Just waiting for someone." The description didn't match Holloway at all, not even close. When Elaine ran the physical profile through old police records, one name emerged, a name that hit her like ice down the spine. Arthur Layton, a drifter, a man with a violent history, a man who had vanished without a trace in the late 1990s, and most disturbingly, the former owner of the warehouse. The revelation unlocked something deep in Elaine's mind. It all began to click into place. The warehouse wasn't just a dumping ground, it was a landmark, a legacy. The pattern of disappearances had started long before Holloway. Had he inherited the darkness, or had someone taught him? At the time of the investigation, the theory of an accomplice had been quickly dismissed. No evidence, no witnesses, nothing to tie Holloway to another suspect. But Elaine wasn't so sure anymore. What if Ray hadn't been the origin of the horror? What if he had simply picked up where someone else left off? What if Arthur Layton had been the first predator to use that warehouse as a hunting ground? And what if he never left? With renewed urgency, Elaine reopened the Layton file. But there wasn't much. No family, no consistent employment. A string of labor jobs, some arrests. But after 1999, he simply vanished. Officially, he was presumed dead. Unofficially, Elaine didn't believe it for a second. She tracked what little trail remained, scoured old logs, cross-checked aliases, even examined death records for any hint of a match under a new identity. But the path had long gone cold. Just when she was about to close the file, once again her phone rang. A trembling voice on the other end. An elderly woman, hesitant, nervous. "I don't know if this means anything," she said, "but I think you should see this." Elaine met her the next morning at a small cafe on the outskirts of Wakefield. The woman, Judith Palmer, was in her 70s, a retired postal worker, frail hands, clouded eyes, but her memory was sharp. She remembered the name, Arthur Layton, and she had something she'd never shared before, letter. One that had sat, sealed and forgotten, in a shoebox in her attic for years, addressed to Arthur Layton, postmarked from Wakefield, dated just 3 months before Ray Holloway's arrest. Elaine's pulse surged as she unfolded the paper. The ink was slightly smudged, but the writing was crisp. Controlled. "You were right. They would have never found them if we hadn't made a mistake. The house is gone, but the roots are still there. I'm moving on now. You should too." No signature, no return address. But the implication was clear. Arthur Layton had still been alive in 2013, and worse, He had been in contact with someone who knew what they had done. The meaning was undeniable. Ray Holloway hadn't been working alone. The darkness in Wakefield stretched further and deeper than anyone had imagined. There had been another, someone who had started it all. Someone who walked away when things got too close. Someone who, for all they knew, was still out there. Elaine Carter stared at the letter as a cold realization settled over her. The case against Ray Holloway was closed, but the story of Wakefield's buried horrors was not. Somewhere, in some forgotten corner of the world, Arthur Layton might still be watching and waiting.